Welcome to another Fun Fact Friday here at the Crockett Tavern Museum in Morristown, Tennessee. Now, in our last few episodes, we discussed an oft-overlooked battle of the American Revolution that was quite possibly the most influential battle in the Southern theater of war, the Battle of Kings Mountain. Of course, we only thought that fitting because, well, it was the month of July, the month in which our nation declared its independence. But moving on in light of that, and in light of the fact that it is now the month of August, well, we thought it only fitting to do a series upon the life of David Crockett, because this was the month in which he was born. So stay tuned as we travel all the way from Limestone, Tennessee to San Antonio, Texas. Now, David Crockett was born August 17, 1786, in a humble cabin to parents John and Rebecca Crockett between the Limestone Creek and Nolichucky River. Now, not much is recorded about David's time living there in Limestone, except for his, what he calls, earliest memory. At one point, while David was about 6 years old, he, 4 of his brothers, and a neighbor boy named Campbell were traversing the river banks looking for excitement, when they happened to stumble across their Paul's canoe. Well, the oldest boys, Campbell included, they got into the canoe and pulled off the shore, leaving poor David behind on the bank. Now, the boys' amusement quickly turned to fear, because they soon found themselves caught up in a strong current taking them towards the falls of the Nolichucky River, wherein, if they had gone over, it would have all mashed them into a fine powder. But fortunately, there was a neighbor out tending his livestock in the field just across the river, and seeing the boys and sensing the danger present, he leapt into action, running through the field and tearing off all his clothes as he went, as though all the devils in hell were after him. And this sight startled the young Crockett so much that he screamed like a panther. But the neighbor didn't have time to pay attention to this, because he knew that the boys were in imminent danger. So when he got to the river, he plunged right in, and where he couldn't walk, he'd swim, and where he couldn't swim, he'd walk, until finally, through great exertion, he grabbed a hold of the canoe and pulled the boys safely ashore. Now, another memorable event happened shortly after this, when the Crocketts moved about 10 miles outside of Greenville. And in this time, Rebecca's brother, Joseph Hawkins, which was David's uncle, he had come to visit the family. And wishing to provide meat for the table, he decides to go out hunting, because it was the fall of the year and deer were plentiful. Now, at this one point, he finds himself in a thicket of brush, and he sees motion. Without a moment's hesitation, he raises his rifle to his shoulder and fires. But to his horror, a human cry echoed along with the gunshot through the valley. The man who Joseph Hawkins had accidentally shot was Absalom Stonecipher, who had been out collecting grapes. And Joseph Hawkins, who had seen the flicker of motion, which was actually the hand of Stonecipher reaching up to pick the fruit, well, he had mistaken it for the twitching of a deer's ear and fired. So Joseph Hawkins takes Absalom Stonecipher to the home of Samuel Humbard, wherein, young David accompanying, he watched as his father went and performed surgery, if you will, upon Stonecipher by dragging a silk handkerchief through the bullet hole and out the other side, thus stopping the bleeding. And of course, as we see, this did in fact save Stonecipher's life, because 15 years after David Crockett's death, Mr. Stonecipher passed away in 1851 at the ripe old age of 82. But now, another memorable event occurs when, after they had moved from that location, they settled at the mouth of Cove Creek. And John Crockett and his business partner, Thomas Galbraith, decided that they were going to go into business together and build a grist mill. But no sooner had they neared the point of completion upon the building of the grist mill, when in 1794 Cove Creek flooded and wiped out the whole operation lock, stock, and barrel. This would be the catalyst for John Crockett struggling for the rest of his life to get out of debt, as well as the Crocketts then moving here to what was then Jefferson County to establish a tavern in 1796. Now, the Crockett Tavern was set up along the old wagon road, which ran from Knoxville, Tennessee, all the way to Abingdon, Virginia. But, as we've discussed in earlier videos, it was really third-rate at best, because John was not only trying to keep a business going, but he was trying to do so while getting out of debt. And so the principal accommodations he kept were for the wagoners which traveled the road. But it was in this time, while at the tavern, that David began to make his acquaintances with hard times. For at the age of 12, he was sold to a Mr. Jacob Seiler to help him drive cattle all the way from here to Rockbridge, or referred to today as Natural Bridge in Virginia. Mind you, this was a journey of a little over 200 miles, one way on foot and with a complete stranger. Nonetheless, when David arrived at the farm of Mr. Seiler, he thought his services completed and wished to return home. But Mr. Seiler had other intentions and used $5 or $6 to try and bait the boy into staying on in his services. Now, David was not interested in this, but Mr. Seiler had put down the money, so he had to play the part of perfect contentment until finally, after about 5 weeks of being there at Mr. Seiler's farm, young Crockett happened to see some wagoners heading down the road just in front of the farm, and he recognized some of them because they had stopped at his father's tavern in previous months. Well, when David Crockett inquired as to where the wagoners were heading, he was elated when they found out that they were going back to Knoxville, and he asked might he be able to accompany them on their journey as he wished to return home. The wagoners agreed upon this and told David that if he could make it to the tavern about 7 miles down the road from where the farm was, that they would put him on the wagon and take him on back to Tennessee. Now, sleep was a stranger to the boy that night because he was excited about the prospect of going home. So, in the pre-dawn hours, he creeps through the house and opens up the door, only to find that he is greeted by a raging blizzard, which made it so difficult to see that he had to guess his way to the road. And finally, he arrived at the tavern in a half-frozen state, just in time to see that the wagoners were hitching up their teams to their wagons. Well, right before they pulled out, they treated David to a nice warm meal in front of a roaring fire, before making their way on towards Tennessee. But the pace was slow, and Crockett grew tired of counting the turns of the wagon wheels, until finally he decided to set out on foot by himself. Now, as he continued to make his way home, he arrived at the Roanoke River, whereupon he was taken over by a man who was just returning from market and heading home with a drove of horses. This man offered Crockett a mount upon which to ride, thus saving him from having to cross the icy river. And the two kept on in companionship for quite some time until finally, 15 miles away from the tavern, the two parted ways, and by evening time, David Crockett had finally returned home to his destination. Well, folks, this concludes just one of the many chapters of David Crockett's life that are going to follow. You trust me, the truth behind the myth is a lot more interesting than what you might think. So stay tuned as we learn more about the life of David Crockett from his boyhood home here in Morristown, Tennessee. As always, we want to thank everyone so much for following along on Facebook and YouTube. Your support is truly, genuinely noted. But of course, the best support is to come on out to the Crockett Tavern Museum and pay us all a visit. And as always, you ought to know this by heart by now, hours of operation and admissions will be listed in the description attached to the video. So until next week, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum, signing off for now and saying goodbye and God bless.